Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm so excited. It's an intimate group to start. I'm sure there'll be a lot of stragglers coming in. But good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jill Weinstock, and I'm the director of Baxter St, and I'm honored to provide this introduction to the artist on artist conversation between Alanna Fields and Elliott Jerome Brown Jr., discussing and commemorating the close of Alanna's solo show, Mirages of Dreams Past. This conversation will last approximately 45 minutes with the opportunity for a brief Q&A portion at the end. We highly encourage you to use the chat feature to post questions throughout today's conversation. Alanna is a 2020 Workspace resident at Baxter St, and her exhibition will remain open till tomorrow should you be able to come by for a visit. However, if you were unable to see the show in person, please stay tuned for a virtual viewing room coming soon to the Baxter St website. Alanna Fields is a multimedia artist and activist whose work examines the dialogue between Black queer bodies in the photographic space through gesture and the negotiation between legibility and masking. Fields' work has been featured in exhibitions at Untitled Art Fair in Miami, Mocata, Pratt Institute, and Prince George African American Museum and Cultural Center. Fields is a 2018 Gordon Parks Foundation Scholar and a 2020 Light Work Artist in Residence. She received her MFA in photography from Pratt Institute in 2019 and has given talks at NYU Tisch School of the Arts and Parsons New School. Elliott Jerome Brown Jr. contemplates the use of discretion in photography. Elliott lives and works in Queens, New York. In addition to various group and solo exhibitions, Elliott has completed residencies at the Arbonne's Arts Center in New York, St. Roch Community Church in New Orleans, and Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine. Elliott was a 2018 Workspace resident at Baxter St, as well as a recipient of the 2019 Rima Hort Mann Foundation Emerging Artist Grant. Brown received his BFA in photography from the Tisch School of Arts, New York University. Baxter St is also thrilled to be honoring Elliott with our Emerging Artist Award at Baxter St on the Rock benefit taking place Friday, June 18th at the Rockaway Hotel. For more information about the benefit, please check it out on our website. Thank you again for tuning in today. I will now hand it over to Alanna and Elliott.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Elliott, also for agreeing to do this talk. I've been such a great fan of your work, and so I'm excited to dive deep.
Yeah, I'm also a fan of your work, so thank you for inviting me to do this talk with you. So just so that we have it up, I'm going to share my screen. And let me make sure I can still see you. Okay, great. So I kind of wanted to start with the work that you have up right now at Baxter St Camera Club. And I guess just to kind of give folks a bit of an overview for how I want envision the conversation going. We'll talk about Mirages of Dreams Past, but as well, I want to discuss the trajectory of your work, specifically how materials have evolved over time, and not simply, speaking to materials for the sake of it, but thinking about what materials and form kind of open up for the meat of this work. What are those materials and forms in service of, and how do they kind of mobilize your intentions? So I wanted to start by asking you, your thoughts and your reflections about this exhibition. I don't remember if this is your first solo exhibition.
Yeah, it's my first.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this was when I did the Baxter St residency as well. It was my first, and I definitely left with an evolving thought pattern from the inception of the show to the end. So I'm wondering what your experience was in reflecting on this time.
Yeah, this time has been really great to slow work, and by that I mean like really sit with the archive and collect more images and spend some time sourcing and really coming up with a curated collection of photographs, which I was going to really build the project around. The residency has been a bit extended because of the pandemic, but that really was a gift. I got to really see the work develop. And in thinking about space, now that the show is about to close, I'm really thinking about initial thoughts with the work and wanting to create a dream space with the images and with the framing and the wax, and to create a space where we could enter into these memories by way of the framing and the wax. But having them in a physical space, I really had to think more about creating space with the pieces, and I began to see them floating and seeing them in relationship to one another, you know, not just at the studio table and then packed up. But it was really important for me to think about this kind of idyllic, utopic queer space where, you know, one could be uninhibited and be oneself and with oneself, and what are kind of the qualifiers of queer identity when it's not coupled with, you know, a lover. You know, what does our spare time, our downtime, our everyday look like as queer people and individuals, just in our spaces and around the home and in nature. So that was kind of the jumping off point, how to create this space, and then how to create more space within the gallery space at Baxter Street.
Could you actually say a little bit more about that experience of the work floating, and like what you think that offers the work? Because I feel like with photography, the traditional means of presentation make it so that we take it for granted, but that is totally an experience of the work for it to be framed in the center of the wall, which doesn't necessarily have to just serve, you know, the logistical center of, you know, being at someone's eye level, but it can be a much more ethereal and act like it can be yet another material in the work itself. So I'm curious if you have any more thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things at play with the floating, or thinking about the fact that these are ancestors, these are people who have now passed on. And, you know, that kind of airiness of spirits and ghosts. And so you have kind of that tied to it with the pieces floating without a finished edge or frame around it. So they're not bound or confined or squeezed into this frame. Rather, it's kind of this endless framing, right? They bleed into the next piece, and they're in relationship with one another. And in some ways I can kind of think about it as like, what would a heaven-like place be there? And what are the people that you would run into? Who are the people that you would run into? And what would they be talking about? And how would they be sharing space with one another? And so with the pieces not being framed, with the spacing and the hanging being not so rigid, not so conventional, we're able really to take them in as a group, right? And what is this group doing in this space, this group of people?
Yeah, as you're talking about confinement, I think a lot about this repeating gesture in at least the work at least the work that follows 2017 of yours, where you're dealing with the square and a rectangle essentially as a way of like omitting information, emphasizing information. So, you know, you talked a bit about how the borderlessness of the work makes it so that the image isn't confined, and yet you're dealing with a shape that I think historically has a lot to do with confinement. So I'm curious about that tension. And, you know, obviously it doesn't have to be one over the other.
Yeah.
So, but it's something that look at the work.
Yeah, I'm really interested in play and you know, contradictions and contrast and things like that. And we're dealing with the box, so that and it's in itself is confining, like you say, but what can we do within that box, within that frame, to create more frames? How can we create some float and fluidity within the thing that is inevitably confining, right? And then you start to think about intersectionality and being Black and queer and woman, or Black and queer non-binary, or Black and queer and male, or Black and queer and trans, any of those identities. And you think about the resilience to push through them and still make a life for oneself, right? Even though we have these intersections, we have these boxes, these boundaries. And so the idea is not to completely break out of them, right? Because the systems are what they are, but how do we work around and create things for ourselves within it, and have moments of breakthrough. In the earlier work, the wax kind of forms veils, and now you're kind of seeing these openings within the wax, and they're not veiling, rather framing. So you see that like movement and how I'm working with the wax through the series, and also like the time periods. I think the way that I handle the wax, you can kind of think about time with that too. Veils with the earlier photographs, like late 1800s, early 1900s. And once we get into like the 60s and the 70s, we're seeing more of an openness.
I have a kind of funny response to something that you shared about the confinement, and specifically it being a mark of resilience, that folks are able to kind of craft a life notwithstanding the confinement, and kind of accepting the confinement as is. And I was like, is Alanna an integrationist? Totally don't have to answer. But thinking about that kind of work from the inside, like working from the inside out way of things, and how I think loudly the working from the outside and just destroying the interior thing is like becoming a much more popular way of change. It's not so much, people don't seem to be as invested in like the institutional markers of success in the ways that they were. They're actually more invested in getting rid of these spaces and in instituting other more expansive space. So something that came up for me as you were speaking just now, and I know as well when we had our conversation prior, when I was thinking about your use of the wax in relationship to these figures, and thinking specifically about trauma and how, yes, our lives are informed by that, and they're informed by violence. They're informed by violent perception and perspective. And, we're tasked with making a life for ourselves in rejection and in consideration of that kind of these ever-present ideals, and also working to make them less present. We're not living in the early thousands anymore. I was born in 1993. You were born in 1990. My experience as a young person around race, gender, and sex were completely different than what they are now.
Right.
There's so much more there's so much more considerate than they existed in the past.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm just everything you just said, I agree. And I think that there's space for, blowing the thing up and building something new. But I think there also has to be space for like honoring like what was, right?
Hmm.
Right? Just so that we don't get away from that. And so that's not,
Hmm.
putting the boxes, the trauma on a pedestal, right? But, look at what we can do in spite of. And that will always be the thing that like draws the fire to like tear the other thing down and rebuild it, right?
Right. Yeah. Yes. I think a lot about the differences in my understandings of success and compared to my parents' understanding of success.
Yeah.
Like my conception is rooted in literal understanding, trying to be like, all right, I'm here, we're all here. How can we make it so that this is like a more like just literally, and to be kind of simple about it, a better place for all of
Mm.
us. Whereas I think success for older generations was that as well, but that better was still rooted in playing with oppression. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna access to certain things, and by virtue of that, you know, kind of perpetuate
Right.
anti-blackness, perpetuate the hierarchies that allow for anti-blackness to, structure our lives in the way that it does. And I think, yeah, success has to look a lot different now. It's
Yeah.
not enough simply to um, be able to live to see the next day, and that's a hard question. That's
Yeah.
a hard question to work with. But let's
Yeah, we could go, on and on.
right. So we didn't speak much about that prior photograph, but the selection
Hmm.
of images that I chose from Mirages of Dreams Past all kind of work with the encaustic and the like kind of collaging and kaleidoscopic um, repetition
Hmm.
in different ways. And I'm interested to hear how you. I'm interested to see what you make of this repetition. Like I
Hmm.
find that when I'm looking at like this work in particular, you lived here inside my mind. I'm fascinated by what is maintained in the slivers and what
Hmm.
kind of gets lost in that repetition until we finally move out of the frame. So with this particular work, I'm looking at how we're losing this person little by little as we move from right to left, which is
Hmm.
an interesting way of reading the photograph. But I guess because like the whole figure is here in the right, we end up kind of transitioning in uh, towards the left. So yeah, I'm curious
Yeah.
about your thoughts in these makings.
Yeah. I think there's this kind of repeating screen effect that's happening on the left panel, like of the piece, before you get to the right. But I'm thinking about visual memory and recollection and what happens when you close your mind and you begin to try to recall a memory, or a person, or little details about a memory that draw you into full view, right? So that's why we're getting this kind of repeated crop here on the left. But I was also thinking about
Mhm.
desire and appeal, and how those things are drawn in. And I was thinking about gender and what it means to be, a Black queer woman that has this uh, sexy like masculinity that's so subtle, but also so very
Mm,
present. And so, I'm thinking about style, and so that was what was important for me to like repeat that boot and repeat that grab of the boot, that gesture, and the detail of the waistbands, and the slim kind of uh, fits of the turtleneck, but there's looseness there. So it's not really about accentuating, but having clean lines, which is something I think is very masculine. But again, back to memory, you know, how it's hazy and it's not clear and we can't always parse it out. And sometimes it comes to us in shifts, right? You ever try to recall a dream and you spend like a whole week trying to piece the pieces together? And so I was thinking about that. Yeah.
And even in the way that you apply the encaustic on the photographs, that also seems to kind of work in this like square way. Like they seem like sections unto themselves, even as they create a full strip.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking a lot about pixelation, but like, what does it mean to have, you know, a pixelated memory, but without those like really sharp boxes, but something that still felt fluid within the, again, confinement. And so we have these brush strokes that feel like arcs or like waves or drips or down streaks or streaks across. And so I'm trying to create movement and a less static effect within these lines and taped boxed areas that are symmetrical in areas and asymmetrical in others.
Could you, well, yeah, I don't know, but you have a background in painting, or, you know, how does the painting become introduced to, or rather the use of the brush, if you don't consider it painting?
Yeah,
To
I consider it painting. You know, that's the language that I have for it. Maybe it will evolve, but I don't have a background in painting. I took a class called Materials and Methods in my last year of graduate school. And, you know, I was doing collage, but I was doing it digitally. And there was, you know, I wasn't satisfied with the layers that I was able to work with there. And I wanted to incorporate more material. And so it made sense to take that class, and the class really blew my mind. I found encaustic. You know, we were doing things like photo transfers and gouache and gold leaf and learning how to make oil paints and doing like a lot of cool things that I have in my Rolodex now for, you know, different modes and ways of working. But the thing that I loved about encaustic was my ability to work with material in a way that did not completely block or prevent access for the photograph underneath. I could dip the photograph. I could dip pieces of paper and layer over the photograph and really work with conceptually the idea of visibility and hypervisibility or lack of visibility. I was able to really shift opacity, but also work with the utility of wax and it being something that seals, right, and protects. So yeah, that's what my jumping off point was, of working with the material. And I started off not painting it on, but dipping. As we were, I think the majority of those pieces, the wax parts are dipped rather than painted. And when you go into Audacity, that's when the painting occurs, the intervention of the brush. And I think that was important because I didn't want to completely block. You know, I wanted these really, really soft hues and washes over. And so I know I needed to have a bit more control with it. And I started working more with heat and opening particular areas up of the wax.
Yeah, that's a really graceful play, like between allowing, like, again, a life to kind of breathe through the like the perimeters of what a person is having to go through to form that life. And I think that comes across really clearly in this image. And even the photograph that preceded it, this feels very protective. Like in the same way that I'm able to enter this work and thinking about the ways the shapes confine the image, I'm also able to enter this work thinking about the ways the wax begins to protect and seal and preserve the photograph, and also the what's taking place in the photograph. This is a picture of somebody presumably navigating their own photo archive in the same way that you are, and being seen in the practice of doing that. Yeah, this one now for me in my headspace, it begins to feel almost like an interpretation of your working with the images.
Yeah.
So I really was excited to put this image into the slideshow, and I'm kind of glad that you pushed back on me including more images from from previous work, because this image, when I first saw it in the show, I was like, first of all, he's very sexy, and it's like, oh, man.
All right, it's very bad.
Like, I'm curious the way in which you navigate desire and the presence of desire, because I think often as artists there can maybe, or at least for me, like I think that there is sometimes like a internal pressure that encourages me to stray away from admitting desire or admitting like lust for or sensuality for the person in the photograph. And I think someone who does that admitting very well is John Evans in the work. That is all, and then there's a host of other of white photographers as well that are very blatant about their interest in the figure. And I'm curious how this spectrum of intimacy or this spectrum of desire shows up in your work with these people.
Yeah, I think desire is tricky, especially when you're talking about, representation in Black bodies and the history of photography. And you think about a photographer like Mapplethorpe and, his whole relationship with photographing Black bodies, specifically Black male bodies. Right. And so we have all of that information in our heads that we're trying to be cognizant of. But I think in light of that, the way that I work with desire in my work is thinking about sensuality more so than the sexual acts, right? How do we engage sensually with ourselves or with one another? How can we, ourselves present as aphrodisiacs, right? With our energy, with our gaze, with our gesture. And I thought about this person and how strong the presence is, how deep and direct the gaze is, how there's a softness underneath, but there's this very present masculinity that even in the posturing is very protective and very kind of refusing the flower, even though the flower is very much so there, right? Or maybe protecting the flower. And I was just thinking about that softness and duality and how you can have both in an image and in a person, and how that's sexy and how that's desirable, and that a lot of people can't achieve that or allow themselves to have that softness and that hardness, that tension. And so I just wanted to honor how that was just all up and through this photograph and really highlight it.
Yeah, there is something about masculinity, specifically as it is performed by presumably male folks, that feels like a shadow. And it's interesting that this image is both this person and the beginnings of a shadow behind them that is beginning to frame him. And there's something, I think, about the desire, like the way that masculinity can be desired in men can often, it often feels like desiring like a void, or desiring like this form that can kind of that is maybe the beginnings of a thing, but it's not yet expressed on the exterior. And yeah, this work makes me think a lot about that. It makes me think about the ways that I get dressed in the morning, and when I maybe do lean into a more masculine dress, or something that I can more definitively refer to as masculine, how I feel like I'm pulling away from something, like I'm kind of like I'm going inward. Like the hood goes on, the hat goes on, my like there's no visible skin. Maybe you see a slither of eyeballs. Like, becomes it becomes protective. But I don't think that fashioning is always read in that way. I think it can be read as reluctant. It can be read as lacking, or whereas like, more feminine expressions are loud, and then they tend to receive more questioning, especially when it's not presented on people who are presumed to be women. So yeah, all of that comes up when I engage this particular work. Let me move. Oops. So yeah, we have this one as well. I like when you do, again, kind of similar to the one before last. I like when I'm seeing multiple of the same image in the frame. And with these streaks, they almost became like wood panels for me. And the kind of nostalgia of those panels, of that design language. But I think, yeah, I don't necessarily want to talk about that. I think I actually want to talk about your interest in style. And yeah, like, yeah, like how does style call you to working with a particular photograph?
I think I'm always so, I don't know about like, how it was for you, but growing up as a like queer young person who wasn't like out and wasn't ever really, high femme, I struggled, to have a little bit of what I wanted to wear amongst like trying to like not get clocked and also, not have problems at home. And so whenever I see images of people with this really strong sense of style and aesthetic, in the way that they dress and adorn themselves, but also their homes, I'm always really drawn to the possibility and proof of that, through these archival images. And so that's something that always catches my eye, before anything else. And I love to really work with that. I love the simplicity of this image here, like a moment before a bath. Maybe before, maybe after, we don't really know. We just see, the water there. But I love this tapestry in the back, and it's weird, and it's like, you're trying to place like where it came from and the time period and all of that. It's kind of out of time in that way, but you have these like kind of this little moment of this checkered bathroom tile in the bottom left, and these stripes, briefs or trunks rather, briefs, right?
It feels like a swimsuit, briefs.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just really drawn to it, and just also like how certain things trigger our memory, like that bathroom tile floor. It's such a small piece of it within the piece, but I know that like I've seen it so many times before. It almost puts me in the space when I like look at it and close my eyes and try to envision right? The bathroom, that radiator. How many times have we seen, you know, a white radiator with that chipped paint on it? Or some sort of like iCat tapestry or things like that. Things that really just kind of draw to a time or period. I'm really drawn to. And like the first image, Close Your Eyes and Remember, really drawn to, you know, the silks and the tapestries on the wall and the wallpaper and all of that, you know, all of the finery, right, that these people were able to have.
I have two jumping off points. One is related to the silk and potentially the being able to kind of like sense the actual textures that constitute the image. So, you know, this person's, I'm gonna go ahead and say cotton briefs, like the kind of maybe woolly tapestry we see in the background, the ceramic tile on the floor, the paint. I wonder if any of that informs how you go about, how you think about the material. Because I know in Nearness of You, there are some other materials that get introduced in addition to encaustic. So I'm curious about that. But then so maybe let's just pin that. But to stay on the style tip, this photograph, I think this is actually the first photograph of yours that I saw. And I was like, oh, what is going on here? I love this photograph so much. And it's, you know, it become like so often the people that are included in your work are people who are often topless, but there's a kind of languidness in the body presentation. And I think about that in terms of the style. So it's not limited to jewelry or other accessories or the clothing, even though this person is you know, really doing their thing. And there's a lot of style to get into with the clothing and accessories alone, but the body language is talking so much. And that is like something that you are really attuned with. Tuned into.
I think we have so much energy and movement in our bodies, you know, and so much expression comes through it, just the way that we sit or stand or hold our body, the way that we engage with each other, handshakes, but also there's just so much style here and it's really effortless, right? Like it's the like flat chain. It's the way that, so the pants are slightly unbuttoned and sagging, you know, on the side, but it doesn't feel, you know, sexualized. It feels very much so about aesthetic, you know? And I'm drawn to that and everything, you know. This series wasn't, you know, about queer archives, but rather, you know, Black children being photographed in housing projects by white photographers and how to subvert that gaze. But also like, what does that looking back look like? And how can it intimidate you as the viewer? Not that you feel fearful, right? But it makes you second guess your gaze and the way that you're looking at it and interacting with this person. And so, yeah, I think style goes into that, but also, you know, having that direct gaze, that confrontation there, I think is really important in all of my work. And so it's either there or it's not. And if it's not there, it's not there for a reason, you know?
Yeah, that kind of leads me into another question about the, you know, the point of transition from the way in which you were working in They Who See We, which feels like almost purely digital way of working, to the way that you begin to work in what we see in Mirages of Dreams Past. And, you know, there are some very clear parallels, like the kind of recollaging of this background of this cruciform building shape into this like motley, again, almost kaleidoscopic view. And then like what the hell was that? Oh, sorry. Somebody, there's music outside. I thought somebody was playing music in the house. I said, who's here? But yeah, like, the kind of intensity of this person's central position up against this space. Like there's a lot of power that I glean um, from this image. And then I'm going to skip ahead, kind of looking at this image here and come to my garden and the concerns that lead you to work with an image like this, thinking about how you identify queerness in images, in archival images of Black women, are people that are presumed to be women. What are the signifiers there that allow you to work with that image, work with the image along the terms that you've been able to with some of the images of the men, like in offering them grace or emphasizing grace? There's a different entry point into the work with that you do with women. So yeah, I'm curious to hear about that trajectory, if you have one, or if you just want to speak to the presence of women in the work. That's also cool. Either.
So on the presence of women in the work, it has been really difficult for me to find images of Black queer women and Black queer women couples. That's not to say that I don't have any, but I have overwhelmingly more of people who are presumably male. And I think that's information, right? I think we have to think about why that is. Why is there an oversaturation of one thing and then seemingly an absence of the other? Find a lot of images of white queer women, and I start to think about, the lives of Black queer women, historically, what we've had to go through, what we've had to surmount and work through, and adding the layer of queerness. And then thinking about these times, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, there's this collection of photographs that I've been really eyeing on these women who presumably look like couples. And there's so many of them in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they're all from 1910. And I start to think about this time period and what does it mean to be wealthy, have money, live amongst your own people in your own neighborhoods, to be able to disregard someone's Black homophobia because they still have to go to your store to shop because you're the one that sells shoes, or you're the one that owns the theater, or this, and that. And I think that collection of photographs is so beautiful because it kind of shows you, what they were able to have back then with resources, but that's so isolated. Because I haven't really been able to find a lot others. When I get into like the 70s and the 80s, I have some, and then early on in the 1900s, and then there's this big gap. It's like, what happened to us? And the thing I love about this photo is the freeness. That's something I'm always searching for. That's like a qualifier: freeness and expression and presenting oneself. And choices, choices of hair, the earrings, the nose ring, thinking of things that are qualifiers within the community that don't necessarily mean other people don't do it, but they're common and they're familiar. I look for familiarity, right? I look for things that remind me of myself, always wearing a simple gold or brass, cuff bracelet, and highlighting hers here in this image and then repeating it. But also just thinking about, the everyday for Black queer people, and being in a park with a bag of cherry tomatoes and a sheet and just feeling it,
Yeah, I also love how you personified the absence on the right too, and that kind of gives its own projection, and they work in tandem with one another.
Yeah.
So I think at this point, yes, we're 49 minutes in. I cannot see the chat if there are any questions there. But if anyone has any questions from the audience and wants to unmute, that would be great. I think if you send something in the chat, I just have to click it once it comes up, but I can't get to it from here. Oh, there it is. Oh, found it. Oh, okay. So Charis Morgan asked if you can talk more about your research process. What is it like building your archive of source material?
Yeah, so I started doing this back in 2018, towards the end of it. And I was just thinking about representation and thinking about, I don't know, I follow this Instagram account, Black Archives, and I love it because, you know, it's just photos that you've just never seen of Black people. But I never seen any queer Black people on it. And so it started having me thinking about where our archives are. And I tried to find some, you know, digital archives and things like that, and I couldn't really find any. And so it was just like, okay, well, maybe this thing doesn't exist in a way that's like accessible to you. And so I started, you know, scouring the internet, scouring eBay to find these images and trying out different search terms and not finding anything, and, you know, trying something like Black woman photo and then finding everything. That whole process of search terms and finding, you know, how that populates different things, but also finding photographs of the same person from different photo collectors who have no information about the people and who aren't really that invested in finding anything out anyway. But you start to, or I start to think about the dissemination of these photographs and how things get lost over time and lost in fires or in transit or discarded by family members who don't want the memory of these images out. And so the process of building the archive is really spiritual. It's really affirming. It's healing work for me. And I hope on the other side, it's like healing work for the ancestors.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that, because that inadvertently answers a question that I also had about who you envision this work for, and if the people in the photographs and perhaps even the person who took the photograph are a part of who the work is for. Because I think for me, it feels obvious that the work is for, in addition, like a contemporary Black queer people who are navigating similar politics or similar boundaries within existing and coming of age, coming into self. So I'm glad to hear you emphasize this being healing for people who maybe didn't have the chance to access that healing in real time.
Yeah.
Is there any other questions from the audience or any comments?
I have a question. Hi, Alanna.
Hi, Alex.
Hey, so I know we've talked about this before, but I kind of can't help but ask every time I talk to you about your work, is the titles of all of your pieces are just so beautiful. And I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit about not only kind of how you come up with your titles, but how, like, what your process is with pairing each beautiful piece of text with each image. Like, I feel like something like Come to My Garden maybe a little bit more self-explanatory or just like a very beautiful fit, but like Kiss My Petals and Weave Me Through a Dream, could you talk about kind of how you pair these together and where you find the inspiration for your titles?
Yeah, specifically for Mirages of Dreams Past, I wanted to pull some cultural media into the work of the time. You know, in the same way we're working with these, you know, signifiers of, you know, the home space tapestries, crushed velvet, fabrics and things of that sort, tile. I also wanted to engage memory through music and something that was, a cultural artifact. And so all the titles are extensions of lyrics from Minnie Riperton's 1970 album, Come to My Garden. And so I love that album. The album didn't do extremely well. It was pretty underplayed. And I'm thinking about underrepresentation in a lot of different ways, not only with these archives, but also with music, but also how whimsical the album is, how free it is, how much it's filled with joy. And this work, I really wanted to make something for myself, but also for queer people that would make us happy and feel joy and give us a break from, the everyday isms. But Kiss My Petal and Weave Me Through a Dream, I was really thinking about the softness of that image and this really quiet, intimate time of bath time and preparing oneself for sleep and what one might dream about that night and just being weaved through one's memory at rest. So yeah, I hope that answered it.
Yeah, definitely. It's just so beautiful. I love the pairing that you come to when you title your pieces. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, of course.
I think we probably have time for about one more question. If anyone has anything, feel free to unmute yourself or ask in the chat.
I'll ask a question. Hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering, with your use, do you envision yourself continuing with this use of archival material, or do you think you'll switch over into more of the contemporary more contemporary scenes, or do you think that you really found its place of the archive and you're going to just keep digging with that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of great artists and photographers that are capturing the now. Can you also hear me? Okay. We're with one here with Elliott. And I love that. What I don't feel like I've seen is our queer history before now. And so I really want to honor that and give that space in my practice. So I have so many projects in my head. Of course, I will work outside of the archive, but I feel like this is kind of calling work for me to do right now. And I think I'll probably be working in this way for a good while. And who knows, maybe it'll be simultaneous work. And that'll be interesting to see those two things in conversation.
Yeah, as that question was being asked, it made me think about how important it is, the color palette of the image itself and being able to understand it as an image from the past. I feel like this particular person that we're looking at in Come to My Garden, the way that their body is presented, their haircut, the way that they're accessorized, all of those are things that I think could advance into now pretty seamlessly. But the tone of the picture itself is what allows us to think about it as being an image from the past. And it feels important that that be something that we take away, and not that we take away directly and not take away in a way that is taken for granted, like that. Yeah, like you've made just clear that that the past is, you're invested in the past because there are some absences, there are some gaps. and not just some, there are a lot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's important that I don't remove or wash the patina of the original photographs. So you get that kind of passing of time there. You know, when the work is in front of you, you may see, you know, a reproduction of the fingerprints that were on the original photograph, or dust or scratches and things like that. So I think it's also important to keep that to reference the life and handling of that photograph, you know, the physicality of it.
Great. Well, thank you, Alanna, for such an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed this. So
Thank you.
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It was great speaking with you about the work.
Thank you so much, Alana and Elliott, for giving us such a engaging conversation and allowing us to get deeper into the work and to celebrate the close of your show. I know us at Baxter Street are really going to miss seeing it every day. I do think, you know, there's such a joyfulness to these images that are steeped in this nostalgia that really kind of resonates, you know, this feeling of positivity and like looking towards the future. And so I think, you know, that's a real gift and lets us think about a lot of things continually. So thank you. And thank you, Elliott, for coming and giving such an engaged conversation as well, and really being thoughtful in your presentation and response. I'm just so excited to, you know, be amongst these two amazing Workspace residents, and just to see them kind of grow and prosper, and lots to think about of what the idea of success means. So thank you for bringing that up earlier in the conversation. Thank you all for joining us. It was really wonderful to have you all here, and I know that it was recorded, so if you want to revisit any of the material or come back to it or share it with other people, by all means. And we really hope if you have an opportunity to come by tomorrow to check out the work in person, it's really worth coming to see it. And thank you both for your time and your generosity.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.